The Unified Galactic Consortium operated on principles as old as space itself. Predictability breeds trust, and trust breeds commerce. For 10,000 years, the various species of known space had managed a remarkably civil arrangement of mutual avoidance and strategic trade partnerships. The ethereals, beings of pure consciousness who had transcended physical form approximately 6 millennia ago, looked down upon everyone else with the serene indifference of creatures who no longer needed anything. The Heptarchian collective, with their 7 distributed minds operating simultaneously across their crystalline forms, conducted commerce with mathematical precision. The Volk, a hive species that nonetheless maintained individual consciousness, operated with choreographed coordination that would make a symphony jealous. Everyone knew their role, everyone played their part. The galaxy hummed along like a well-oiled machine, minus the oil and the machines, but you understood the concept. Then humanity showed up, and everyone collectively wished they had stayed hidden behind their primitive little solar system. Not that humans were unwelcome, mind you. The consortium prided itself on inclusion and enlightened expansion policies. When humanity's first representatives arrived at Station Nexus Prime 17 years ago, they were greeted with the standard protocols: formal recognition, trade agreements, technological exchange program, and a polite suggestion to stand over there while everyone else conducted actual important business. Humans seemed satisfied with this arrangement. They were polite, enthusiastic, and refreshingly easy to ignore. They bought supplies, sold raw materials from their underdeveloped colonies, and generally minded their own business. The ethereals barely noticed them. The Heptarchians filed their economic reports in predictable quarterly cycles. The Volk acknowledged them during scheduled interface meetings. Perfect. Boring. Exactly how civilized space was supposed to function. Humans, it turned out, had different ideas about what civilized space should look like. The consortium first noticed the problem when a human trade expedition to the outer reaches went missing. Not unusual. Space is vast and unpredictable, full of cosmic radiation, unstable wormholes, and the occasional rogue asteroid that hadn't gotten the memo about gravity wells. The standard protocol was to file a report, collect insurance, and move on. The ethereals issued a sympathetic statement about the unfortunate vagaries of spacefaring life. The Heptarchians adjusted their profit margins accordingly. The Volk updated their risk assessments. Then the humans found their people. The retrieval expedition that emerged from the wreckage of the Kepler sector wasn't particularly impressive by galactic standards. 3 ships, barely faster than light, held together with what appeared to be a mixture of salvaged components and sheer determination. The humans who disembarked were disheveled, exhausted, and looked like they had been through something that the average sophisticated species would have deemed catastrophically lethal. They had flown through an unstable wormhole cascade, alone, without proper navigation system, without backup protocols, without any reasonable hope of success. They had done it anyway, because apparently they had decided that impossible was more of a suggestion than a law of physics. The officials at Station Nexus Prime, who reviewed the incident report, found themselves simultaneously disturbed and confused. The ethereals, who experienced time in ways lesser beings couldn't comprehend, found the whole affair temporally inefficient. The Heptarchians noted that the humans had violated 7 established safety protocols, and lived to tell about it, which their mathematical models insisted shouldn't be possible. The Volk registered concern, filed it away, and waited to see if this was an anomaly or a pattern. It was a pattern. Over the next 3 years, humans proved spectacularly unable to accept galactic norms. When a trade colony on Zix-9 experienced a catastrophic failure of its life support systems, humans didn't evacuate orderly portions of the population like any sensible species. They invented makeshift environmental suits from recycled materials and kept the entire colony running on what could only be described as applied desperation and an alarming disregard for logical resource allocation. The colony should have lost 40% of its population. Instead, they lost approximately nobody, sustained by the sheer stubborn determination of their inhabitants to not die on Zix. When a mining operation on the Granite Expanse encountered a territorial dispute with a local predatory species, the human mine director didn't retreat to safe zones or call for mediation specialists. He apparently decided that the species in question just needed better understanding, which led to a weeks-long series of increasingly bizarre negotiations conducted partially through a system of hand signals and what the incident report charitably described as charade. The territorial dispute was resolved. The predators didn't attack again. Nobody could quite explain why, but the humans seemed satisfied and the predators seemed confused, which counted as a win in anyone's book. The real alarm bells started ringing when a human research team stationed at the Andromeda Scientific Outpost discovered a potentially catastrophic flaw in the station's primary reactor core. The flaw had been overlooked by 3 different species of engineers over the past 2 decades. Not only did the humans identify it, but when official channels moved at their traditional glacial pace of bureaucratic caution, the humans simply decided to fix it themselves, using unauthorized access codes, bypassing safety protocol, implementing modifications that violated approximately 14 different consortium regulations and contradicted at least 3 separate engineering philosophies. The reactor didn't explode, it ran more efficiently than it had in decades. By this point, the various species of the consortium had reached an uncomfortable consensus. Something was fundamentally wrong with humanity. Not evil, necessarily, not malicious, just wrong in a way that defied comfortable categorization. The ethereals, in their infinite wisdom that had been cultivated over millennia, couldn't quite explain the human tendency to solve problems through methods that shouldn't work. The Heptarchians ran their data through every computational model available, and kept getting results that indicated a fundamental flaw in their understanding of causality. The Volk, practical to their core, simply issued a warning memo suggesting that humans were not to be trusted with standardized procedures. Then the incident at Outpost 47 occurred, and everything the consortium thought it understood about the galaxy took a hard left turn into territory that no amount of bureaucratic procedure could navigate. It started simply enough. A diplomatic delegation from the consortium's eastern territories arrived at the outpost to conduct routine negotiations with the human colony there. The humans served refreshments. The ethereals observed with detached curiosity. The Heptarchians documented interaction. The Volk representatives noted compliance with basic courtesy protocols. It should have been boring. It should have been forgettable. It should have been entirely unremarkable. Instead, a rival faction of Volk separatists launched an attack on the station. This was supposed to happen. It was a known threat, factored into security assessments, managed through standard containment protocols. The consortium representatives began executing their carefully documented emergency procedures. The ethereals prepared to phase into non-corporeal states for protection. The Heptarchians activated their defensive crystalline formations. The Volk delegation established defensive positions according to established tactical doctrine. The humans, meanwhile, looked at the situation and decided that none of this was how you actually responded to a crisis. What followed was a blur of activity that confused everyone involved, terrified the consortium representatives, and left the attacking Volk faction genuinely bewildered about what had just happened. The humans didn't retreat to defensible positions. They advanced. They improvised weapons from station materials. They coordinated with the diplomatic team in ways that defied established hierarchy. They moved with purpose and coordination that wasn't choreographed through a hive mind or calculated through quantum computing. They just moved, and things worked. The attack ended. Nobody died, though the attackers were thoroughly incapacitated. The station was damaged but structurally sound. The ethereals, the Heptarchians, and the Volk delegation all stood in stunned silence, watching as the humans calmly began taking inventory of the damage while cracking jokes about the structural integrity of station wall. In that moment, an understanding began to crystallize throughout the consortium's highest command channels. This wasn't a problem that could be managed through policy updates or diplomatic protocols. This was something entirely different. The humans weren't operating according to any rules the consortium understood. They were unpredictable in ways that felt almost dangerous, not because they were malicious, but because they seemed genuinely incapable of accepting that certain things were impossible. The real horror, though, was just beginning to dawn on the consortium's collective consciousness, and it had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with something far more unsettling. The terrifying possibility that humanity's greatest strength wasn't a weapon at all. It was their fundamental refusal to acknowledge limitations. 3 weeks after the Outpost 47 situation settled into bureaucratic resolution, the consortium received distressing news from the mining colonies on Drexel Prime. A massive geological catastrophe had triggered what could only be described as an extinction-level event. The planet's tectonic plates had shifted, triggering cascading seismic failures that made the entire region uninhabitable for most carbon-based lifeform. The Ethereals issued a philosophical statement about the impermanence of physical form. The Heptarchians began calculating insurance payouts and colony relocation costs. The Volks submitted standard evacuation protocols. The humans, observing this from a distance, apparently decided that extinction was negotiable. Nobody instructed them to do anything. Nobody requested their assistance. The situation was tragic, but ultimately manageable through established procedures. The consortium had evacuation protocols refined over millennia. The humans lacked the technology, the expertise, and frankly the authority to do anything about the situation. So naturally they mobilized an emergency response force, composed entirely of personnel nobody had authorized and equipment nobody had approved. What made this genuinely terrifying to witness was what the humans actually did when they arrived at Drexel Prime. Standard procedure dictated abandoning the colonies and salvaging whatever technology and resources could be extracted before complete structural collapse rendered everything inaccessible. The humans looked at this situation and decided they would save the colonies instead, not abandon them, save them. A distinction that seemed to elude every sensible calculation the consortium's advisory networks could generate. The methods they employed suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of physics itself. The human engineers began constructing massive stabilization platforms using salvaged materials, improvised engineering, and what appeared to be pure stubborn determination to ignore geological reality. They didn't have the proper equipment. They made it from scratch. They didn't have proper structural calculations. They used mathematics that made the Heptarchians question whether human understanding of engineering was fundamentally flawed or devastatingly accurate, in ways nobody understood. They worked continuously for 72 hours without rest, rotating personnel in shifts that suggested they had somehow discovered ways to function beyond normal biological limitations. The Ethereals, observing from a safe dimensional frequency, registered something approximating alarm. The Heptarchians' computational systems began generating contradictory results that suggested either humans possessed knowledge of advanced physics, or they were operating on principles that defied mathematical modeling. The Volks simply noted increased productivity levels and questioned whether human physiology included hidden genetic modifications that enabled extended operational capacity. But the real moment of horrifying clarity came when the human operations officer, speaking to the colony coordinator through a communication channel, explained the stabilization efforts with casual confidence that suggested failure wasn't actually an option. They had considered, "We're going to save this colony," the officer stated, "because leaving people behind violates approximately every principle we operate on. And frankly, the structural integrity isn't actually as compromised as the preliminary surveys suggested. We've identified 3 support zones where we can anchor platforms, and if we reinforce them properly over the next 48 hours, the tectonic stress should dissipate sufficiently for long-term habitability." This statement was contradicted by every legitimate engineering analysis the consortium possessed. It was also completely accurate, which was the part that kept everyone awake at night. Over the subsequent 72 hours, the humans executed a stabilization protocol that shouldn't have worked, couldn't have worked, and yet somehow did work with remarkable effectiveness. They saved 40,000 lives. They preserved colony infrastructure worth billions in credit. They accomplished what the consortium's military and engineering forces had calculated to be genuinely impossible. Not just difficult, impossible. The Ethereals convened in chambers that existed partially outside conventional space-time, and attempted to understand how beings with such limited technological sophistication had managed to accomplish something that contradicted established physical principles. The Heptarchians ran their data through 17 different computational frameworks,
and kept generating the same impossible conclusion. Humans possessed some form of problem-solving capability that allowed them to succeed in situations where failure was mathematically inevitable. The Volk issued additional security protocols and began cross-referencing human activities with known technological theft and reverse engineering operations, searching for some logical explanation that didn't result in the conclusion that humans just refused to accept that certain things were impossible. What terrified the assembled leadership wasn't human capability, it was human psychology. They didn't approach crisis situations with the proper calculation of odds and risk assessment. They approached problems with the assumption that problems could be solved if you simply refused to surrender to their impossibility. They didn't ask whether something could be done. They assumed it could be and then worked backward to discover the methods. They treated the laws of nature as though they were merely difficult obstacles rather than fundamental limitations. In conference chambers throughout the galaxy, one horrifying realization began to crystallize. Humans weren't operating according to any logical framework the consortium understood. They were operating according to something far more dangerous. They were operating according to hope, stubbornness, and an almost pathological refusal to accept defeat. Against such forces, all the advanced technology and mathematical precision in the galaxy seemed almost quaint.
The consortium attempted to study humans the way it studied every other species, through observation, data collection, and comparative analysis. The research teams assembled were composed of the finest minds available across multiple species and dimensional states of being. Their conclusion, delivered after 6 months of intensive investigation, was simultaneously comprehensive and utterly useless. Humans possessed no special genetic advantages. Their physiology was remarkably mundane by galactic standards. They weren't telepathic. They didn't possess distributed consciousness networks. They couldn't manipulate matter through pure willpower or calculate quantum equations intuitively. They were, in almost every measurable way, unremarkable, and yet they continued to accomplish things that defied every logical model the consortium possessed. The breakthrough came not from scientific analysis, but from observation. A human research team on the Arctic station of Glacius Prime encountered a catastrophic situation when the station's secondary thermal regulation system failed during a solar storm that knocked out all communication with the rest of the galaxy. By every reasonable calculation, the station's population should have experienced a slow, inevitable decline as temperatures dropped beyond survivable parameters. The ethereals calculated that approximately 97% of the station's inhabitants would perish within a standard rotation. The humans, apparently operating on different mathematics, decided that 97% was unacceptable and that they would preserve everyone instead. What followed was a masterclass in improvisation that horrified and fascinated the consortium's observers in equal measure. The humans didn't follow emergency protocols. They invented new ones. They repurposed life support equipment for thermal generation. They created makeshift insulation from materials never intended for such purposes. They established work schedules that rotated personnel through heated zones in ways that should have resulted in equipment failure, but somehow extended operational capacity indefinitely. They rationed resources with surgical precision, while simultaneously refusing to accept that rationing meant death was inevitable. They did the impossible not through superior technology or advanced mathematics, but through sheer creative determination and an infuriating refusal to acknowledge that their situation was actually hopeless. When communication was restored 3 weeks later, the station's population was not only intact, but had actually improved their living conditions through innovations they had developed under crisis. The ethereals, observing this data, finally articulated something approaching genuine concern. The Heptarchians generated multiple updated threat assessments. The Volk issued expanded security protocols that now included provisions for containing human problem-solving initiative. But what truly disturbed the galactic leadership was discovering that humans could weaponize their fundamental characteristics in ways that no military doctrine had anticipated. A human colony on the border territories of contested space found themselves isolated after a political shift unexpectedly placed them in disputed territory, claimed by 3 separate factions. The colony was militarily insignificant, Their technology was centuries behind the competing powers. They possessed no weapons of consequence, and no allies capable of providing meaningful assistance. By every reasonable analysis, they should have capitulated to whichever faction moved fastest to seize control. Instead, the colony's leadership declared complete and total neutrality and began implementing a policy of absolute cooperation with all three factions, simultaneously. They provided resources, information, and services to each group without preference or discrimination. They treated each occupying force with courtesy and hospitality. They made themselves genuinely useful to everyone involved. And through this deliberately paradoxical approach, they created a situation where eliminating the colony would create political disadvantages for whichever faction did so, while maintaining the colony would provide distinct advantages to all three. Within 6 months, the three competing factions had negotiated a settlement that allowed the colony to maintain independent status. The humans had achieved through cooperation and strategic usefulness what military forces couldn't accomplish through conquest. They had transformed their weakness into advantage by refusing to acknowledge that they were supposed to lose. They had simply made themselves more valuable alive than dead, and the competing powers had accepted this logical conclusion despite their initial assumption. The Volk submitted a detailed analysis questioning whether human behavior should be classified as intelligence, or as a fundamental misunderstanding of how the universe functioned. The Heptarchians began developing computational models that suggested human success rates defied probability at a level that implied either extraordinary luck or fundamental flaws in conventional threat assessment systems. The Ethereals, existing partially outside normal temporal flow, began discussing whether human persistence might actually represent a form of causal manipulation that their current understanding of physics couldn't explain. What emerged from this period of observation was a deeply unsettling pattern. Humans didn't solve problems better than other species. They solved them differently. They approached situations with the fundamental assumption that success was possible if you simply refused to accept defeat. They tolerated conditions that would drive other species to despair or madness. They formed emotional bonds that transcended logical self-interest. They sacrificed personal advantage for collective benefit without requiring calculation of game theory to justify the decision. They operated on principles that had nothing to do with optimization or efficiency and everything to do with stubbornness, determination, and an almost religious belief that failure was optional. In laboratories throughout the galaxy, scientists from a dozen species gathered around datasets that suggested something profoundly disturbing about humanity. Humans weren't evolving toward predictability, they were evolving away from it. Their capacity for adaptation wasn't based on biological evolution or technological advancement. It was based on psychological frameworks that allowed them to redefine problems until they became solvable. They treated reality as negotiable. They treated physics as advisory rather than absolute. They treated defeat as a temporary condition rather than an inevitable conclusion. The consortium's highest councils began to understand, with growing horror, that humanity's greatest advantage wasn't a weapon or a technology or a strategic doctrine. It was the absolute conviction that no situation was truly hopeless, combined with the stubborn determination to prove it repeatedly in the face of all evidence, suggesting otherwise. Against such an approach, military superiority seemed almost irrelevant. You couldn't conquer species that refused to admit defeat. You couldn't intimidate beings who seemed genuinely uncertain whether fear was a feature or a bug in their psychological architecture. The incident that changed everything happened not on some distant outpost or colony world, but at the consortium's central administrative hub, Station Nexus Prime itself. A catastrophic system failure combined with a deliberate sabotage attempt from a faction seeking to destabilize galactic governance created a situation of unprecedented crisis. The station's primary systems began cascading into failure. Life support degradation accelerated beyond recovery thresholds. The administrative records that formed the foundation of the consortium's legal and financial infrastructure faced complete data corruption. The Ethereals, operating at velocities that transcended normal temporal flow, began calculating the situation's parameters and projecting inevitable outcomes. Their conclusion, delivered with the serene certainty that came from beings who had transcended physical limitation millennia ago, was unambiguous. The station would be lost. Approximately 40% of the consortium's administrative population would perish. The financial and informational losses would cripple galactic commerce for months. Recovery would require decades of coordinated effort and would fundamentally reshape the power structures that had remained stable for 10,000 years. This was acceptable loss. Tragic but manageable. The Ethereals began executing evacuation protocols. The Heptarchians, running their calculations through quantum processors that could model every conceivable variable simultaneously, reached an identical conclusion through different mathematics. 40% casualty, 40% probability of station salvation if resources were perfectly allocated, 40% chance of administrative recovery within 10 years. The mathematics were clear. The outcome was predetermined. They began resource allocation procedures to minimize economic disruption. The Volk, coordinating their distributed consciousness across billions of individual nodes, assessed the situation and determined that operational losses of this magnitude fell within acceptable parameters for a species-level civilizational entity. They established containment protocols. Then the humans arrived, and everything changed. The human response team that entered the compromised station wasn't the largest emergency force in the consortium's arsenal. It wasn't the most technologically advanced. It consisted primarily of engineers, doctors, maintenance personnel, and administrative support staff, who had decided, entirely on their own initiative, that losing 40% of the consortium's population was completely unacceptable regardless of what the mathematical models suggested. What followed over the next 72 hours defied comprehension from every conceivable perspective. The humans didn't follow evacuation protocols. They established rescue operations. They didn't prioritize administrative records over person. They did both simultaneously through methods that suggested they had invented new categories of coordination that didn't exist in any established organizational framework. They worked continuously without rest, rotating through tasks with the kind of determined coordination that suggested they had decided collectively that stopping was not an option. They cannibalized station systems to repair other station systems. They created makeshift life support by repurposing equipment never designed for such purposes. They established communication networks between failing sections to coordinate rescue efforts across collapsed structural barriers. They violated approximately 73 different safety protocols and security regulations while somehow ensuring that nobody actually got killed in the process. The Ethereals, observing from their privileged dimensional perspective, began processing something that their transcendent understanding had difficulty categorizing. Humans were making choices that defied optimization. They were prioritizing people over resources. They were accepting personal risk in situations where mathematical analysis suggested that risk was unjustifiable. They were operating according to a framework that the Ethereals, in all their millennia of existence, had fundamentally failed to comprehend. The Heptarchians recalculated their models as the situation developed, and found themselves generating impossible numbers. The casualty count remained at 0. The administrative recovery proceeded ahead of schedule. The station's system stabilized rather than collapsed. Every variable they had calculated to be inevitable was being systematically replaced with outcomes that their models insisted couldn't occur. Their quantum computers began generating error messages, suggesting that either the fundamental nature of reality had changed, or their understanding of causality required complete revision. The Volk, practical and pragmatic as always, simply noted that the humans had accomplished something that contradicted every defensive parameter they had calculated. They updated their protocols again, though at this point the updates seemed almost futile. How do you establish defensive procedures against beings who refuse to acknowledge that defense should ever require accepting loss? When the crisis ended, Station Nexus Prime was intact. The administrative records were recovered. The casualty count was precisely 0. 40% of the station's population continued living, breathing, and contributing to the consortium's ongoing operations because a collection of humans had decided that acceptable loss
was completely unacceptable. In the aftermath, something fundamental shifted in how the consortium viewed humanity. It wasn't fear anymore, though fear remained. It wasn't confusion anymore, though confusion persisted. It was recognition, actual genuine recognition, that humanity represented something that galactic civilization had fundamentally failed to account for. The Ethereals issued a statement, acknowledging that transcendence of physical form did not necessarily equate to understanding all possible forms of consciousness. The Heptarchians began developing entirely new computational frameworks based on the principle that some outcomes defied mathematical prediction, because they operated on premises that mathematics couldn't model. The Volk established new protocols reclassifying humans, not as potential security threats, but as fundamental variables that destabilized predictive models. And in the consortium's councils, a terrible, ironic realization crystallized into something approaching acceptance. Humans weren't monsters. They never had been. Monsters could be understood. Monsters operated according to comprehensible motivations and predictable patterns. Humans were something infinitely worse than monsters. They were believers. They were creatures driven by conviction rather than calculation. They were beings who looked at the universe's limitations and treated them as challenges rather than boundaries. They were civilizations built not on technological superiority or tactical advantage, but on the fundamental refusal to accept that failure was inevitable. The galaxy was changing, though most species didn't realize it yet. The consortium had spent 10,000 years operating on the principle that peace came from mutual understanding and predictable interaction. But peace, it turned out, also came from the terrifying realization that one species refused to participate in the orderly collapse of situations everyone else had already accepted as lost. The humans had turned refusal into a weapon. They had weaponized hope. They had weaponized stubbornness. They had weaponized the simple, infuriating conviction that no situation was actually impossible if you were willing to work hard enough and believe strongly enough that success was achievable. And in that moment, the consortium finally understood why, of all the species in the galaxy, humanity alone had earned not respect through military might or deference through technological superiority, but something far more unsettling: the uncomfortable acknowledgement that they had somehow become the most dangerous civilization in known space. Not because they were killers or conquerors, but because they were believers in a universe that had largely abandoned belief as a viable survival strategy. They were beings who had turned optimism into operational doctrine. And against such forces, all the mathematical models and computational power in the galaxy seemed almost quaint. The humans weren't superior. They were just completely, infuriatingly, impossibly different. And that difference, it turned out, was far more powerful than anyone had ever anticipated.